Howdy y'all, I'm Jacob. Welcome back to the ranch. We're almost done with kidding season and we're just about to kick off lambing season. And before you know it, well, hopefully before you know it, we're going to be back out and rotationally grazing on pasture. But before we get there, we have some evaluations we need to do and some decisions we need to make on how we're going to get back to grazing. And that's what's on the agenda today, so let's get going. Before I get too far into looking at the pastures, I just want to take a second to introduce new viewers to the area that we're working with and remind those that have been with us for a minute the pastures that we're going to be looking at. The land that we've been blessed to look after for my uncle is roughly 80 acres. And of that space, we really have it divided down into roughly 4 pastures that we can use for grazing. Those pastures include the front pasture, the south, the lower pasture, and the east pasture. And if you've been with us for a little bit, the pastures that we worked on at the end of last year, or really last fall, were the front pasture and the south pasture. And those were 2 areas we no-till drilled in a mix of cool season grasses that we were planning on using both through the winter and early spring, and as a cover crop or green manure to help improve the land that would hopefully take off and grow, and that we could work back into the soil to help improve the pastures. Well, I don't have the best of news, but I guess that's a good point to get started. And the first place we're going to get started is here in the front pasture. I don't really have a good aerial view to show, but I will point out a couple things that kind of highlight the issues that we saw with this pasture. So I've made a few posts about this in the past, but right after we initially seeded this pasture, we got enough moisture that the seeds that we put into the ground sprouted. Well, as is West Texas weather, that moisture was it for an extended period of time, and it ended up drying out. And that cycle repeated itself about 3 different times, where we would get enough moisture for the seedlings to green up and get a little bit of growth in, and then everything would dry out and turn brown. And unfortunately, that had a pretty bad effect in both the front and south pastures. And this area is probably a good representation of what a majority of this pasture looks like. You can really see in where the furrows would have been from the drill, where the triticale that we put in did sprout and start to grow. But that small little growth is about all it was able to do. And you can really tell outside of the triticale where it's come up, we're getting a lot of native grasses and forbs pop up. And those pesky mesquite trees. And that is pretty much how the majority of this pasture, as well as the south pasture, looks. But there are a couple exceptions. I'll say a couple, there's probably more than that. Let's say a few exceptions to how this pasture's looking. I'm going to show you that next. Excuse me, chicken. I don't think you belong here. We're always getting into everything. Alright, so in this area, there's a few things that I want to point out. And the first are going to be these spots. I don't know how well you can see them in the camera, but that's one, and there's a couple more in line behind it. And what's unique about these spots is that If you've seen some of our previous videos, these are spots where we would pull off bad parts of hay bales and throw them out on the pasture. And I'll show you this one as an example, but you can still see some of that residual material from the hay bale here on the ground. What I'm thinking that has done is it's provided both a source of carbon for the soil as well as ground cover to keep the moisture in place, whereas the rest of this field did not have that. And in addition to these few little spots, there is one spot here that is a location that we had bale grazed in the past, and it is much more green than the other locations in the pasture. But as you can see, there was not any ground cover that was left in this spot. So this is purely from the nutrition that the previous bale grazing had left here. So there's one more spot I want to show y'all before we get into evaluating the pasture. And it's a little bit different than each of those two scenarios. And that would be this spot here that's by the gate going into this pasture. So this area has had neither a... Well, hello, Grace. How you doing? How you doing? You doing okay? You doing okay? Okay. Go back to Mom. No, she doesn't. No, she doesn't. What was that saying? Oh, yeah. So this spot has had neither ground cover placed on it, and we've never fed out hay right here for any of the animals that we run to eat. And I don't know if you can tell well from the camera, but there's a mix of some native grasses and forbs popping up in here. The triticale is growing. And we also have some of the purple top turnip and daikon radish that really took off in this location. And what's different about this spot that the other two have not had is that it is directly downstream of the horse pen. So every time it rains, all the nutrition that comes off where the horses are at and runs off their horse pen runs out into this area specifically and diffuses before going any further. So my assumption that the reason this area did so well is that the water retention was much better than the other parts of the field. Now, before we take a deep dive into this pasture and start doing some tests, I want to run over to both the lower pasture as well as the east pasture and show y'all how the grazing experiments we did in both of those areas turned out, at least at this part of early spring. We're out here in the area of the property that we call the lower pasture. And this pasture is roughly 12 to 13 acres. And it's the last place that we stopped grazing last year. And there's really three parts of this pasture that I want to cover. This pasture is the place that we seeded just straight triticale on the perimeter of after we did the front and south pasture last fall. And I've done a couple updates and talking about how we didn't really get much of any germination off the seed that we planted out here, except for in one spot, and this is that area. And as you can kind of tell, this area is fairly green, and if I bring you in close, you should be able to pick out the furrows where all those seeds went in. So of all the places in this pasture, this was the best as far as seed germination. But as you can tell, and because of the same conditions that I talked about in the front and south pasture, the seeds here eventually did germinate, although they germinated late, and as you can tell, they haven't really grown all that much. The next portion I want to show you is kind of indicative of what the majority of this pasture is made up of. Now, outside of the seeding that we did last fall in the perimeter, we've not done any other real work to this pasture as far as adding in any additional seed or groundwork. This pasture is the one that we did do our very first rotational grazing in. In that grazing, we found out that the goats were really fond of little blue stem, and that's the patch I want to show you now. So all the orange you see out here are where the old seeds for the little blue stem came up in the fall. And as you can kind of tell, that roughage the goats didn't really mess with, but they do get down into the base of the little blue stem bunch and eat the leaves of the grass down there. Now, on camera, I'm sure it's really obvious just how much of this is little blue stem from the old growth that's still left. At the time of this recording, it's the 8th of April, and the little blue stem is really starting to wake up, and you can tell here at the base of the plants where it's starting to wake up and become vegetative. And I can almost guarantee if I were to bring the goats out here now that they would devour this new growth, which kind of leads me into the planning as far as it pertains to rotational grazing this year. And as of right now, I'm really leaning towards starting down in this pasture. One, because it actually has a perimeter fence, and two, it'll be a good place to get the kids and the lambs out with the ewes and the goats to make sure they get used to electric. Alright, I've got one more spot to show, and then I think we'll move on to the east pasture. Now, the last spot in this pasture that I want to cover was the last stop for grazing at the end of last year. And if you haven't seen that video, at the end of last year, we stopped in one location in this pasture and kept the herd here for probably a solid month as we fed out roundels and supplemented the herd before moving them up to the goat pasture for kidding. And this spot has just taken off. I will say that this is probably the greenest piece of ground on the property right now. And a vast majority of this spot is going to be side oats grama with a little bit of little blue stem and a little bit of switchgrass mixed in. I was worried when we stopped for such a long duration in this spot that we may hurt the ground, but after seeing this, I'm kind of surprised. And just like in the other blue stem patches, this little area is starting to take off as well. And seeing bunches like that just take off is really reassuring. The other aspect of this area that I wanted to show is where we bale grazed. And we did a combination of both rolling out hay as well as placing an entire round bale into one spot. And this area here is where we rolled out the round bales. And you can still see as there's a good cover of litter on the soil. So I'm hopeful, because I'm still planning on letting this specific spot rest for a good bit longer. I'm hopeful that these areas will continue to improve as it's got cover on the soil and it'll be able to capture the moisture as we get it this spring. Alright, so let me show you the area that we did a whole bale graze. And unlike the spot where we rolled out hay, you can definitely tell here and there where that litter is much more dense. And there's not just a whole lot growing in it. And I can really tell as I walk through it that there's a lot of cushion and a lot of protection for the ground here. Now there is one additional spot that we put an entire bale in that's a little bit different than these two. And I don't know how well you can tell, but this entire area right here that's dark green is one spot that's really taking off. I'm not entirely sure why this area is different, but the wheat seed that was in this wheat bale really got a lot of ground contact, and it's taken off and growing, which is a big reason why I want to continue to let this area rest just to see how it performs. So we're definitely seeing a lot of positive results from leaving the herd in this one area and providing a lot of impact via bale grazing. And it's definitely reassuring to see that happen. Alright, I'm going to jog on over to the east pasture to show you all the results that we're seeing so far from the long-term rotational grazing that we did last summer over there. Well, y'all, quick jog later. Okay, it was more like a lazy stroll. But regardless, we're here in the east pasture. And this is the largest continuous pasture that we have on the property. This is roughly 30 acres, and this is where we spent the majority of our time last year doing a full rotational grazing with the goat herd and the sheep there for a little bit at the end. We did a couple experiments in this pasture in that we varied the length of stay to some degree as it was based on how much forage was in a particular area as we moved through. But we also experimented with mowing down all of the forage once we moved the herd out, as well as leaving some areas just as the herd left it whenever they moved out of that location. And you can definitely tell some significant differences in the two. Those areas that we mowed off as we moved the herd out are definitely much more green than the areas that we left standing. Now, some of that is an illusion in that I think the woody material that was left behind, or the old material that was left behind, is kind of blocking your view of some of the green that's coming up behind it. But as I'm walking through here, I can definitely tell the areas that we mowed off have a lot more small seedlings that are popping up than the areas that we left a lot of material standing. Now, I'm still way too new at this to draw a definitive conclusion on which is the better practice at this point. But what I can say is that I don't think this pasture is still quite ready for grazing. While there is a lot of green starting to show, and I'm excited to see that, to me at this point, this growth is still too new and too short to support the grazing. Now, we do have moisture in the forecast, and with any luck, if the weatherman's correct, we'll get about a week of good rain. So if our luck holds out and we're able to get that moisture, I'm hoping this pasture will really take off. Now, before I move back over to the front pasture to delve further into the soil out there, I just want to show y'all this portion here. And this was the area that I showed video of me bringing the tractor in and clearing. See, there's the little burn pile I made. And the thing to really note about this is that I really tore up the ground as I came through here trying to rake all the material together. And the grass out here is really taking off strong. So while this pasture is showing a lot of promise and a lot of good signs, I think we're going to be better off starting grazing this year in the lower pasture. But time will tell. We're expecting to get a good bit of moisture this weekend and through next week, so hopefully we'll see some pretty good results from that. Alrighty, I'm going to head back over to the front pasture. We're going to delve into the soil out there and see what we can find out. Well, y'all, I had to duck over here behind the trailer to try and get out of the wind. As I was working on this video, it kind of dawned on me that I may be trying to cram just a little too much into one video. So what I think I'm going to do is I'm going to split it up into two parts. This first part, we will have covered the state of the pasture and what we are kind of looking at as we move into finally getting the herd back onto pasture. And I'm going to save the second part to showcase some at-home tests that I do to really delve into the soil that's in the front pasture to try and figure out what may or may not have occurred to keep it from growing, besides not getting enough moisture during this winter. But for now, I think that's going to do it for this video. Thank y'all for tagging along, and I hope to see you next time on Wag Ranch.